Greetings, fellow humans. Katrina here. Quick disclaimer, I'm a professional, not your professional. Nothing I'm about to say should be taken as medical, legal, or otherwise advice. This podcast is purely for education and amusement. That is it. Disclaimer over. So I thought that I would talk a bit about what I don't know today about issues, more specifically structural issues, and even more specifically, cultural and social structural issues around mental disorders. So today I thought I'd read a little bit out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that 5th edition text revision that is my favorite right now. And that is because it recently came out, I would say this year or last year. I'm not entirely positive, but the last edition didn't come out, or it came out in 2013, May of 2013 specifically. I remember that because that was the year and month that I graduated with my master's degree. So let's dive into it. Mental disorders are, and this is on page 16 of the big blue book. Cultural and social structural issues. So mental disorders are defined and recognized by clinicians and others in the context of local sociocultural and community norms and values. Cultural contexts shape the experience and expression of the symptoms, signs, behaviors, and thresholds of severity that constitute criteria for diagnosis. Sociocultural, that's a hard word, say it 5 times fast. Sociocultural contexts also shape aspects of identity, such as ethnicity or race, that confer specific social positions and differentially expose individuals to social detriments of health, and that including mental health. These cultural elements are transmitted, revised, and recreated within families, communities, and other social systems and institutions, and change over time. Diagnostic assessment should include how an individual's experiences, symptoms, and behaviors differ from relevant sociocultural norms and lead to difficulties in adaptation in his or her or their current life context. Clinicians should also take into account how individuals' clinical presentations are influenced by their position within social structures and hierarchies that shape exposure to adversity and access to resources. Key aspects of sociocultural context relevant to the diagnostic classification and assessment have been carefully considered in the development of the DSM-5 TR. So now it moves on to discuss the impact of cultural norms and practices. The boundaries between normality and pathology vary across cultural contexts for specific types of behaviors. Thresholds of tolerance for specific symptoms or behaviors differ across cultural contexts, social settings, and families. Hence, the level at which an experience becomes problematic or is perceived as pathological will differ. One thing I like to note is I do not automatically pathologize things like cannabis use. So it goes on to say the judgment that a given behavior, experience, or concern requires clinical attention depends on the cultural norms that are internalized by the individual and applied by others around them, including family members and clinicians. To accurately assess potential signs and symptoms of psychopathology, clinicians should routinely consider the impact of cultural meanings, identities, and practices on the causes and course of illness. For example, though any of the following factors, levels of vulnerability and the mechanisms of specific disorders, for example, by amplifying fears that maintain panic disorder or health anxiety. Social stigma and support generated by family and community responses to mental illness. Coping strategies that enhance resilience in response to illness or help seeking pathways to access healthcare of various types, including alternative and complementary treatments, and acceptance or rejection of diagnosis and adherence to treatments, affecting the course of illness and recovery. Cultural contexts also affect the conduct of the clinical encounter, and this is including the diagnostic interview. Cultural differences between the clinician and members of treatment team and the individual have implications for the accuracy and acceptance of diagnosis, as well as for treatment decision, prognostic considerations, and clinical outcomes. I remember reading once something about the clinical outcomes being better, or, well, the dependent, yes. So, or maybe it was correlated. Yeah, correlation does not equal causation, but it was correlated that people, the strength, this is it, the strength of the therapeutic relationship can affect the clinical outcomes. And so the stronger the bond as far as the therapeutic relationship, the strength of that relationship can affect the outcomes of the therapy. And so I think that's across modalities too. Like it doesn't matter CBT, DBT, SFBT, somatic experiencing, EMDR, that rapport is important. So now it goes on to discuss cultural concepts of distress. Historically, the construct of the culture-bound syndrome was a focus of work on descriptive phenomenology in cultural psychiatry and psychology. Since DSM-5, this construct has been replaced by three concepts that offer greater clinical utility. 1. Cultural idiom of distress refers to a behavior or linguistic term, phrase, or way of talking about symptoms, problems, or suffering among individuals with similar cultural backgrounds to express or communicate essential features of distress. For example, stating I feel so depressed to express low mood or discouragement that does not meet the threshold for major depressive disorder. An idiom of distress need not be associated with specific symptoms, syndromes, or perceived causes. It may be used to convey a wide range of discomfort, including everyday concerns, subclinical conditions, or suffering due to social circumstances rather than mental disorders. For example, most cultural groups have common bodily idioms of distress used to express a wide range of suffering and concerns. So that's an interesting thing. Cultural groups have a common bodily idioms of distress. I would say that we also have common, and I don't know that I'm using the word idioms right, but common bodily gestures is maybe another way to put it when we're talking about pleasant emotions as well. And the example I'll use with this is the new emojis feature in the iOS 17 update. So you give it yourself a thumbs up and it shows a thumbs up. You give 2 thumbs up and it actually shows fireworks behind you. So a lot more. I'm not going to go into it. So 2. So these are the cultural concepts of distress. You got 1, the cultural idiom of distress. 2, the cultural explanation or perceived cause refers to a label, attribution, or feature of an explanatory model that provides a culturally coherent concept of etiology or cause for symptom, illness, or distress. For example, the attribution of psychopathology to stress, spirits, or failure to follow culturally prescribed practices. Causal explanations may be salient features of local classifications of disease used by laypersons or healers. That's an interesting thing to think about. Causal expectations. So that can be anything from a religious perspective of exorcism to stress on the autonomic nervous system and having more of the sympathetic side of the autonomic nervous system active, which is the surge of adrenaline and cortisol and all that. Or even, I wonder what else. It says stress, spirits, or failure to follow culturally prescribed practices. Oh, what comes to mind with that is actually the 40-hour work week. So it is expected, almost even demanded in the United States of America at this time that you work a full-time job if you're an able-bodied adult. And an able-bodied adult, with or without children, is expected to put in a minimum of 40 hours, and there aren't that many hours in the week. There's only 24 hours in a day. 40 of those are expected to be at work. And if you tie into that on time is late, early is on time, and late, you might as well get fired or not show up anyway. That's not accurate. That's just the thought process sometimes. And so if that is something that it contributes to the stress and overall expectations, what does it say? Culturally prescribed practices. If, let's say, for example, that the 48-hour work week is contributing to the toxic culture of overworked and being underpaid and the praising of certain behaviors like self-sacrificing your time with your family, sacrificing your own health in order to put the needs of others ahead of the needs of one's own existence. Those things are praised. And so I get this information from Gabor Mate. This is a side note recommendation for a book, The Myth of Normal. Haven't read it yet. Full disclosure, I don't know what's in it. I don't know. But it came to mind as something that challenges those culturally prescribed practices. He puts out what trauma does to the psyche and the body, and he describes different things about how it is a cultural issue. Mental health, in and of itself, is affected by culture. And that makes a lot of sense because it's all interconnected. I am ascribing to the biopsychosocial model of things. And so I'll go back to the cultural concepts of distress. So, third is the cultural syndrome, refers to a cluster or group of co-occurring distinctive symptoms found in specific cultural groups, communities, or contexts. For example, attack of nerves. And this is actually in a different language, ATAQUE, and then there's a space DE space NERVIOS. So you can Google that if you like. It means attack of nerves. The syndrome may or may not be recognized as an illness in the local cultural context. For example, it may be labeled in non-medical ways. But such cultural patterns of distress and features of illness may nevertheless be recognizable by an outside observer. So a cultural syndrome that comes to mind is ojo. If you don't know what ojo is, then you can Google it. I don't know what Google says about it, but from the culture that I came from, it was that feeling of like evil eye is what I think it translates to. And so it's like somebody gave you the evil eye, and so then you're experiencing some sort of distress as a result of that look. When in reality, we know that somebody looking at us can't do anything to us, but it is a cultural explanation for that particular perspective of distress. And I think that's an interesting connection my brain drew. So these three concepts I'll review: cultural idiom of distress, cultural explanation or perceived cause, and clinical or cultural syndrome. These three concepts, for which examples and discussion are provided in the section 3, Culture and Psychiatric Diagnosis, they suggest cultural ways of understanding and describing experiences of distress or illness that can be elicited in the clinical encounter. They influence symptomology, help seeking, clinical presentations, expectations of treatment, illness adaptation, and treatment response. The same cultural term that serves more than one of these functions and usage can change over time. For example, depression names a syndrome, but has also become a common idiom of distress. Oh, I feel so depressed, that kind of thing. The impact of racism and discrimination on psychiatric diagnosis. Clinical work and research in psychiatry are deeply affected by social and cultural constructions of race and ethnicity. Race is social, is asocial. Whoops. It says here, race is a social, not a biological construct. It is used to divide people into groups based on superficial physical traits, such as skin color. Although there is no biological basis for the construct of race, discriminatory practices based on race have profound effects on physical and mental health. The social process by which specific categories of identity are constructed on the basis of racial ideologies and practices is termed racialization. Racialized identities are important because they are strongly associated with the systems of discrimination, marginalization, and social exclusions. Other aspects of identity, including ethnicity, gender, language, religion, and sexual orientation, may also be the focus of bias or stereotyping that can affect the process of diagnostic assessment. Side note, I was looking at the ACLU website the other day, maybe yesterday or the day before. Anyway, on that website, it mentioned that there were like 496. I don't know if that's the right number, but over 400 and under 500. It was very close to 500, if I recall correctly. So almost 500 bills in the United States of America across various states in the United States of America are pushing anti-LGBT plus legislation under the guise of healthcare, education, and it even imposes, in some instances, on civil rights. And so things like gender affirming care is at risk. And that was just a random tangent that came to mind because we're talking about racism and discrimination. And it mentioned all of the things, right? And so back to racism. Racism exists at a personal, interpersonal, systemic, institutional, and social structural levels. At the personal level, racism gives rise to internalized stereotypes and experiences of threat, devaluation, neglect, and injustice that affects individuals' health and well-being. At the interpersonal level, racism includes not only explicit behaviors, but also microaggressions. Side note, if I remember correctly, an example of a microaggression can be asking someone, "What are you?" That's not helpful. Human, it's the answer. Which are everyday slights and offenses that communicate negative attitudes towards specific stigmatized groups with stress-inducing and traumatizing consequences. Systemic/institutional racism refers to the ways that discrimination is embedded in everyday practices of institutions and organizations, including healthcare and psychiatry. Systemic racism may not be expressed in overt racial ideologies, but may be maintained by implicit and unintentional biases, habits, routines, and practices that result in misrecognition and inequity. As a result, individuals can participate in and inadvertently contribute to systemic racism without consciously endorsing racist ideas. The concept of social structural racism emphasizes the way that racism and discrimination are manifested in the organization and norms of society and public policy, with pervasive inequities in economic resources, power, and privilege that impact exposure to health risks and access. Right, so health risk and access to health care. The structural violence and oppression of racism have physical, psychological, and social consequences, including the negative effects on mental health. Racism is an important social determinant of health that contributes to a wide variety of adverse health outcomes, including hypertension, suicidal behavior, and post traumatic stress disorder, and can predispose individuals to substance abuse, mood disorders, and psychosis. Negative racial stereotypes and attitudes affect the psychological development and well being of racialized groups. Other adverse consequences of discrimination include unequal access to care and clinician bias in diagnosis and treatment. For example, misdiagnosis of schizophrenia among African Americans presenting with mood disorders and other conditions, more coercive pathways to care, less time in outpatient treatment, and more frequent use of physical restraints and suboptimal treatments. Clinicians should make active efforts to recognize and address all forms of racism, bias, and stereotyping in clinical assessment, diagnosis, and treatment. Now it says attention to culture, racism, and discrimination in the DSM-5 TR. So this is where it kind of dives into a little bit of that information. And then we'll talk about sex and gender differences and wrap up with that. So during the DSM-5 TR review process, steps have been taken to address the impact of culture, racism, and discrimination on psychiatric diagnosis in the text of disorder chapters. A cross-cutting review of Committee on Cultural Issues composed of 19 U.S.-based and international experts in cultural psychiatry, psychology, and anthropology reviewed the text for cultural influences on disorder characteristics, incorporating relevant information in the sections on culture-related diagnostic issues. A separate ethno-racial equity and inclusion work group, which was composed of 10 mental health practitioners from diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds with expertise in disparity reduction practices, reviewed references to race, ethnicity, and related concepts to avoid perpetuating stereotypes or including discriminatory clinical information. An example I heard of a stereotype that is not helpful is like the strong Black woman. I heard a study somewhere that said that there was a study or a survey of doctors, like physicians, actual medical doctors, who thought that there were skin differences in like thickness between races. It sounds crazy, I know, but this is the world that we live in, is that sometimes inaccurate information, generalizations of populations occur, and then there are detrimental consequences to making those overgeneralizations, which I do believe overgeneralizing is a cognitive distortion. I'd have to look that up to see exactly the definition of it, though. So back to the DSM-5 TR is committed to the use of language that challenges the view that races are discrete and natural entities. The text uses terminology such as racialized instead of racial, to highlight the socially constructed nature of race. When the term ethno-racial is used in the text, it denotes the U.S. Census categories such as Hispanic, white, or African American that combine ethnic and racial identifiers. The emerging term Latinx, singular and plural. Side note, I've just heard on the internet that that's not a favorable term, but according to the experts, that's the preferred term. And it says in the book, the emerging term Latinx is used in place of Latino, Latina to promote gender inclusive terminology. Side note, if you're unfamiliar with the Spanish language, it does have gendered language when referring to different things. Male typically is like ending in an O, and female or feminine is typically ending in an A. So that's one of the differences with the Spanish language, and that is actually a Latin-based language. So Latin even has it, and then there's a few other languages that have similar stuff, Portuguese, that kind of thing. The term, so back to the book, the term Caucasian is not used because it is based on obsolete and erroneous views about the geographic origin of a prototypical pan-European ethnicity. The terms minority and non-white are avoided because they describe social groups in relation to a racialized majority, a practice that tends to perpetuate social hierarchies. And nobody's better than anybody else. When necessary for clarity in reporting epidemiological or other information based on specific studies, however, the text uses the group labels from relevant studies. The term culture is used not to refer to a discrete social group. For example, prevalence differs across cultures, but rather to indicate the heterogeneity of cultural views and practices within societies. So the terms cultural context or cultural backgrounds are preferred instead. The sections on prevalence for each disorder were reviewed to ensure that findings are present with clear reference to the geographic areas or social groups included in data collection. For example, in the U.S. general population, this avoids overgeneralizing the findings and communities not yet studied. Speaking of communities not yet studied, isn't there like a tribe or something in Brazil that remains untouched by modern humanity? I think there's only like one sighting of them. Maybe there's been more since this, but a David Attenborough documentary, I believe, had a helicopter fly over these people and they were pointing arrows up, and they basically don't have any contact with the outside world, is my understanding. So back to what I was saying in the DSM, prevalence data on specific ethno-racial groups were included when existing research documented reliable estimates based on representative samples. The work group was concerned that data from the non-representative samples may be misleading. This explains the limited inclusion of data on certain ethno-racial groups, notably Native Americans. There is an urgent need for research on this and other important groups. Prevalence estimates also depend on the absence of assessment bias. The text indicates when more research is needed to ensure the accuracy of available data. Users are encouraged to read the sections on cultural-related diagnostic issues to contextualize the sections on prevalence. The last thing that I want to touch on today is, I don't know about a lot of sex and gender differences, and I don't know about the whole binary thing of gender. I think it's more of a spectrum. That's my own personal opinion. And in the book, it says sex and gender differences as they relate to the causes and expression of medical conditions are established for a number of diseases, including a growing number of mental disorders. Sex refers to factors attributable to an individual's reproductive organs, and XX, that's female, or XY, chromosomal complement. Gender is a result of reproductive organs as well as an individual's self-representation and includes psychological, behavioral, and social consequences of the individual's perceived gender. Excuse me. I've been going on for a while, haven't I? Okay, we're almost wrapping up. Much of the information on the expression of psychiatric illness in women and men is based on self-identified gender, and thus we commonly use gender differences or women and men or boys and girls in the DSM-5 TR. However, if information is available and pertinent to, quote, sex, end quote, for example, sex differences in metabolism of substances or life stages restricted to only one sex, such as pregnancy or menopause, we use the term sex differences or male and female. Sex and gender can influence illness in a variety of ways. First, sex may exclusively determine whether an individual is at risk for a disorder. For example, as in premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Second, sex and gender may moderate the overall risk for development of a disorder, as shown by marked differences in the prevalence and incidence rates for selected disorders in men and women. Third, sex or gender may influence the likelihood that particular symptoms of a disorder are experienced by an individual. For example, ADHD may manifest differently in boys and in girls. Sex and gender may also have other effects in the experience of a disorder that are indirectly relevant to psychiatric diagnosis. For example, certain symptoms may be more readily endorsed by men or women, and this endorsement contributes to differences in service provision. For example, women may be more likely to recognize a depressive, bipolar, or anxiety disorder and endorse a more comprehensive list of symptoms than do men. Reproductive life cycle events, including variations in ovarian hormones during the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, or menopause, may contribute to sex differences in risk and expression of illness. Thus, the specifier with peripartum onset that can apply to brief psychotic disorder or to a manic, hypomanic, or depressive disorder or major depressive episode denotes a time frame wherein women may be at increased risk for the onset of an illness episode. In the case of sleep and energy, postpartum alterations, postpartum is after birth, postpartum alteration are often normative and thus may have a lower diagnostic reliability in postpartum women. The manual is configured to include information on sex and gender at multiple levels. If there are gender-specific symptoms, they have been added to the diagnostic criteria. A sex-related specifier, such as, quote, with peripartum onset, end quote, of a mood episode provides additional information on sex and diagnosis. Prevalence estimates based on sex and gender are included in the prevalence section of each disorder text. Finally, other issues that are pertinent to diagnosis and influenced by sex and/or gender considerations can be found in the section Sex and Gender-Related Diagnostic Issues in the text for relevant disorders. That's what I'll wrap up with today. It does go on to talk about the association with suicidal thoughts and behaviors before it goes on to additional researches and future directions, which it does talk about the diagnosing, coding, and recording procedures, blah, blah, blah. If you are interested in reading more, like I said, it's the DSM 5TR. The American Psychiatric Association put it out. So, if you like today's episode, go ahead and click the button on the website. And remember, I appreciate each and every one of you simply for existing.